everyone has been enjoying the day so far. It's been truly inspiring for me, so I hope you've had similar experiences. I want to introduce myself. I'm Nicole Crescenzi. I'm the admissions lead at Springboard, and I have the awesome honor of introducing today's Women in Technology panel. As a woman and as a mother myself, I couldn't be more invested in today's important conversation, and I'm personally dedicated towards this vision of empowerment as we collectively cultivate powerful alliances, share strategic resources, truly advancing unimagined trajectories for and with each other. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today, Amanda Coopersmith. She is the program manager for Parity Professional Program. Like many of us here, she's deeply impassioned for creating equitable spaces for women and underrepresented groups. So let's give it up for Amanda and our panelists for today.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here, and to Springboard for an amazing conference today. This topic was actually requested by the Springboard community as a topic that you all wanted to see covered in this conference this year, and I think it really makes sense with the changing zeitgeist and kind of the conversations that have popped up over the last year and a half between Me Too and the Women's March, and some recent important books by Emily Zhang on Brotopia, Emily Chang, and Ellen Pow's Reset. So I think there's been a lot more focus on this topic in the last year, and companies are really starting to think, how do we build more equitable cultures? How do we build better spaces for women and underrepresented groups to thrive? And I think there's also more conversations between women on how do you set yourself up for success, and how do you thrive in spaces that have been typically unfriendly to women. And so I am thrilled to be here with 4 women who have not just survived, but also thrived in technology, to share some of their stories and insights on how to be successful in this industry. And so without further ado, I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, give us a little bit about your current role and how you got to where you are now.
You want me to start? Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Bekah Thayer. I'm the Lean In Programs Manager at Sheryl Sandberg's foundation, and I have a background in finance. Actually, I started out as a management consultant, and it was incredibly rewarding, learned so much, but ultimately I wanted to work in a space that I was more passionate about, so I actually transitioned into global health and did a fellowship in Uganda for a year, specifically focused on women's empowerment and menstrual hygiene solutions, doing the data analytics and impact evaluation for them. Really reaffirmed the fact that I wanted to work in this space and be able to use the education and experiences that I've had in order to close the gender leadership gap and to get to a more gender equal world. So I couldn't imagine a better place to do that than at Lean In, and I've been there for about a year.
Hi, I'm Megan Witmer. I'm a UX researcher at the Zuckerberg Initiative. Before that, I was at Facebook, and before that, I was in grad school studying social sciences. So I'm trying to think what's, to your point, for me, it's been really interesting because I actually started in engineering, but not as Silicon Valley calls engineering. I was a bioengineer and worked in pharma for a while. And honestly, I never have felt a lot of what all of this buzz is about. And so even that has been interesting as a reflection on my own experiences, to kind of say, like, is that something I'm missing? Is there something about the way I'm approaching my job that doesn't make me feel these things? But happy to talk more about that as well. I'm not trying to diminish people who do. It's actually myself reflecting on, like, where is this happening and for whom, and try to be, like, thoughtful about how I can play into that in a way that's helpful for others.
Hi everyone, I'm Mancha. I'm a data scientist at Instagram right now. Prior to Instagram, I was in New York at a startup. So if you guys want to learn about startups and how to make that transition from, a small company to a large one, I'm all happy to give any advice. I was at Blue Apron for around 2.5 years. So was able to get in at a very young, I guess, stage in that experience, where I did all sorts of analytics problems, from product to consumer to marketing to operations even. So that was a very rewarding experience. And prior to that, I was a consultant. And in terms of background, I was a computer science engineer with a minor in consumer psychology. So in terms of like how to navigate the tech industry and how to kind of, I definitely felt underrepresented in my undergraduate degree, which is why I think I maybe just plummeted to consulting, because I felt like maybe that's where I can just feel like I fit in, but then kind of miss the technical side a lot, which is why I came back. And so I'm happy to talk about those switches that I've made.
Hi, I'm Sameera. I'm a data science manager at Uber. I started out as a mechanical engineer. I did my undergrad at IIT Bombay. And after that, I did a PhD in robotics. And what's interesting about these for this panel is that all these three, mechanical engineering, IIT, and robotics, have extreme low diversity. So I started out by being thrown into the deep water. My undergrad class had 4% women. Mechanical engineering class had 2%. There was a class of 100 guys, 2 girls. And we had the record for the highest number of girls at that point. Because before that, it was 0 or 1. So yeah, coming from there, I finished my PhD 2008. Robotics is also a very heavily male-dominated field with a bro culture. So yeah, saw that. And since then, I've been in I was a researcher at Qualcomm for 5 years. I worked in a couple of startups. Most recently, I was at a startup called Amino, where I started the data science team, built out the data science team. And right now, I'm at Uber, again, building out the data science team. So I'm hiring. So yeah, and happy to talk about the transitions.
Well, thank you everyone for starting us off with your stories, and I think talking about transitions is probably the right place to start. So how did you decide to jump into technology knowing that there was kind of this mixed reputation, and what advice would you give to women who are just transitioning into tech roles?
Yeah, so I started out as a mechanical engineer. I was too young at that point to even realize that this would be an issue. The advice I would give people today, starting out today, is that be careful which companies you choose. There are a ton of companies there that are working really hard to create very good culture. You will find places that have a healthy culture, so be very mindful when you're starting out. Don't be in a rush to just take the first job offer you get. So that's the advice that I would give you.
Can I dig in a little there? What exactly would you look for in a company culture? Like, what is a good sign of a positive culture, or maybe red flags to look out for through the interview process that might tell you a culture is not a good fit?
Yeah, so the interview itself, there is a lot of signal you can get from the way people interview. You can tell if there is a bro culture, right? So one thing that I try to do is when I go to an interview, I try to be very authentically just myself. So I will, make it clear that yeah, I'm not going to work crazy hours. I have a kid. This is the way I'm going to work. So I make it very clear. So that's like a self-filtering mechanism, saves me time. The second thing is you can look at, are there women in leadership roles? That's usually a good signal. You can be very explicit about what is the culture of your company. Why do you care about diversity? Yeah, so I think these are some of the questions I'd ask.
I think one thing I would add to that, because I agree, is thinking about it as you go into this interview is you want to present yourself strongly and have good ideas and things, but I'd also think about how much does the interview feel like a interesting conversation, that you have ideas and they have ideas, and that feels, again, to your point about being authentic, that you're feeling authentic in that moment, but you also feel like your ideas are being heard, that they're getting, that people are extrapolating off of those ideas. So just kind of get that sense of, is this a conversation I could have multiple days on end with these people? And I think that regardless of whether you're worried about bro culture or just generally, I think that helps you think about, does this feel comfortable to me, and do I feel energized by these interactions? One other thing on the transition point, for me, I had a really rough transition because I came as a social scientist into Facebook, and I'm not kidding, 5 years ago, I did not know the difference between Android and iOS. I thought when they said deep linking, they were say de-blinking, like blink, blink. So I was like at my computer, like typing everything anybody said because I didn't know what was going on. And so I would say that is still totally surmountable. Like now I've been very successful in my career, and I think there's 2 points that have happened in that. One is Google everything, ask a lot, 3 things. Google everything, ask lots of questions. Like, I don't think you should be apologetic for what you don't know because you were hired for very specific reasons. And thirdly would be find someone you trust and run your work by them, like somebody that isn't actually evaluating your work. And I think all those things can help you transition to understand like how to work into that culture. And I mean that more from a performance standpoint, because I think you should feel comfortable right from the start. It's just whether or not your work is matching what that role needs you to do.
I think the other thing that I found incredibly helpful was just to add on to some of these great points is your future manager is very, very important. Don't underestimate that. I think there's a statistic out there that 75% of Americans that were actually surveyed said that they left their job because of their manager, not the position themselves. So keep in mind that you want to find someone that shares your values, but has traits that you want to eventually imbibe. So those 2 things are key in looking for a manager. So find someone that you feel shares your values. It doesn't even have to be a woman. In fact, some of probably my most valuable mentors oftentimes have been men who have kind of like forced me to be bolder than I have been. So find those values, make sure that you guys share the same values, and then also make sure that that person has traits that you want to learn from. And the second thing I would, I think there's some really great research by the organizational psychologist Adam Grant, so some of you might be familiar with his work. He talks about givers and takers, and he talks about high-performing teams. And I found that my best work has been done in like this environment of givers. So when you have a team focused on the mission of the company as opposed to their own personal, some, I guess, minor ego or any sort of insecurities that they're housing, you oftentimes are going to probably do your best work in those environments. So definitely find people who are focused on the mission of the company, and they might not agree with you, and that's fine on certain opinions, but you have to find people that would still agree to have a conversation, be open-minded about your perspective, so that you guys can debate on any sort of opinions that you don't agree on. So I definitely think, find people with the same value system, and then make sure your manager is someone that you really aspire to be, or that someone who really inspires you.
And I agree with all these points. The one last thing that I'll add, when you think about career transitions, I think it's easy to be intimidated by transitioning industries and not thinking that you're qualified, especially for women. I think it's important to remember that men will apply for jobs when they meet 60% of hiring criteria. Yes, and women will wait until they meet 100%. And that's not because women lack some sort of special confidence gene. I think the reality is that in a lot of workplaces, it is an uneven playing field, and recognizing that all of these subtle dynamics do actually impact and your confidence erodes. And so I think knowing the data and still putting yourself out there, because it really doesn't hurt to try when you're transitioning careers, is really important. And then the last piece, when you're evaluating an organization, there's things like gender fair, which will actually look at their policies, look at their marketing messaging, is it respectful of women, a lot of different things around, do they have paid parental leave, regardless of your gender, do they have flexible working policies? I think there's a lot of really nitty-gritty things that you can look at, regardless of just the culture and the individuals that you interact with in an interview process, to see if they practice what they preach.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing that. And I think the 60% statistic is really helpful. Actually, for me, when I've looked at jobs, I've actually counted the bullet points, and if I meet at least 60%, I force myself to apply. So it's helpful to have that in your back pocket, that information, so that you can be prepared. I think something that kind of came up a little bit was imposter syndrome. I think everybody faces imposter syndrome in tech, but especially women. There's a lot of research that shows that women are specifically impacted by that. So I would love to hear from our panelists here a little bit about have you dealt with imposter syndrome, and kind of what models do you use to deal with that in your everyday life?
So I can speak to that. Last week was my first week at Uber. And sure enough, day 3, I'm like, oh shit, I'm probably not that good, right? So I've gotten better over the years. So I still get that feeling, I still get that thought, but it doesn't bother me right now. And the reason is that I have this sort of a mental model, which is that if I think that I'm not as good as what my resume is, then it's this narrative in my head, which is that, okay, I possibly couldn't be as good as what these people are saying. I had somebody say that I'm a unicorn, and I'm like, yeah, right, that's not me, right? So it's not possible, right? So there is this narrative going on. And that narrative makes a lot of sense, because through the years, I have not seen many women. I have not seen, even if I look at the resume, the prior that I have, some of you are data scientists here, right? Like the prior is not what it won't look like me, right? If I look at my resume, it looks like somebody else. So that narrative that comes in that, hey, you're probably not that good, it makes sense. But then I have to push back and ask, is there evidence? Is there data to support that I'm not that good? And if there is no data, then I'm better off choosing a narrative that serves me, which is that, yeah, here's my resume. These are the people who interviewed me. Here's a narrative that serves me. And this is a technique that I have found to be extremely useful to me. I actually learned it through an executive coach that I worked with. So because this comes up again and again, where in different situations you doubt that maybe it's you who's not doing something right. Maybe there's a meeting and you're like, I sounded really stupid. Maybe right now I feel like, okay, I'm sounding really stupid, right? And then, so that's a narrative, and you push back saying that, is there evidence to support that? If there is no evidence, then I'll choose a narrative that serves me, which is, I'm doing great.
Yeah, I've definitely felt it, and I think we should all acknowledge everyone's felt it, and even the people you admire the most have felt it. So over time, I think you get over it. What Bekah said about the 60% totally rings true. I actually had a really interesting experience where I applied for a job I was tremendously overqualified for, to the extent that the interviewer told me that you should not be applying for this job because you should be applying for this other job because you have way more skills. And it was this weird reality check where it made sense that I was doubting myself more than the interviewer. And I think those sort of things you think about are just this inner critic that is trying to kind of suppress your inner potential. So the way I kind of think about it, and I read a book that really helped me, is like, think of your brain as a company with different departments. You have a department which is supposed to help in revenue creation and is supposed to propel you forward. You also have a risk management department, which is always trying to thwart your efforts. Those departments need to be there. And your risk management department oftentimes helps you, avoid any sort of like bad decision making. But oftentimes it screams louder than it needs to. And so that's how I imagine my brain whenever I hear these voices, is I acknowledge that there's this different department that is trying to fight for time and fight for their agenda. But keep in mind what the goal is. Keep in mind that there's this other department that should be achieving their efforts for your own success. So that's the model I use.
So for me, well, I already told you the embarrassing Android iOS part. So obviously I have had imposter syndrome. But I did read this really interesting book. I can't remember the author, but the book is called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. I highly recommend it because what it does is it operationalizes some of the things that women do that actually even enhance the problem of imposter syndrome. And so for me, it's been very helpful because then I can, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but I can externalize sort of the difference between what is actually I'm feeling and what is just either a pattern that I've been taught to behave as a woman or something that has become a habit in myself for other reasons. And then as a result, it's easier to catch it and shut it down, which is sort of to the point about finding your data, right? Like finding the examples of why am I doing this to myself? But I think it can be really helpful because then you're tearing it apart as a like constructive problem that you can address the same way that you would address any other project. And then that you start creating new habits that start lessening those feelings over time.
Yes, I've also experienced imposter syndrome. I think it's really powerful once you realize that everybody else has too, and don't be afraid to talk about it. Find peers that you work with, share your experiences and be vulnerable, and find people who are going to advocate for you and push back against those thoughts that you're having when you don't think that you're qualified. I think you can also tactically go through your resume and write down your specific accomplishments or positive reviews that you've received and have that folder and remind yourself. And I think oftentimes, we were talking about this earlier, girls are socialized to be perfect, whereas boys are often socialized to be bold and to take risks, and that oftentimes allows you to practice failure. And the reality is that imposter syndrome is strongly correlated with striving for perfection, and you're not going to achieve perfection. And I think especially for the women in the room, realizing that that's oftentimes associated with it. If you're going to create amazing new organizations, startups, whatever you want to do, you're going to have to fail. I think some of the most successful traders oftentimes lose more money than they win. All-time basketball stars will actually miss most of the shots that they take. And so I think just reframing how your perspective is when you look at what you want to accomplish, not striving for perfection, will actually help you a lot with imposter syndrome.
On the topic of failure, I think it's really important too that we spend time kind of talking about our failures and about how they make us grow. I think that sometimes what's missed in this is some of those huge swings that you take, even if they don't work out, they end up really giving you a lot of opportunities to advance yourself professionally and, with your own growth. So I would love to hear some stories if anybody has moments where they had a huge failure and kind of what you took out of that and how it actually helped you long-term in your career.
I can start on this one. So when I first started at Facebook, I thought that, which I'm not there anymore, but I was, and I thought that if I just did good work, that it would be fine, that everything would kind of come back full circle because that's how you do things, was in my head. I would just keep working. And that actually came to bite me pretty hard because I wasn't doing enough self-promotion. And so I just want to bring that up because I also think that's something that I do have seen females on my teams do more. So the main point, though, is again about reframing it. It wasn't self-promotion so that I could like climb the ladder or these things that felt uncomfortable to me. It was self-promotion because I did good work and people should know that that work is out there so they can find it and they can use it. So so I would just say, don't be afraid to say, hey, this project is awesome. Go out and sell all this great work that you've done. And that would be a key learning. Another aspect of that is that it's okay to rely on others to sell your work. So in this case, I had a lot of stakeholders that were very pleased with what I was doing. I had some that might not have been. But going out and finding those people who had seen a lot of value in it and also getting them to push that work so that it was making the impact that it needed to make is also part of the process. So you don't have to be your own cheerleader. You can also find the people that have found value in the relationship and encourage them to move that work forward as well.
Yeah, I can share a failure of the many. So I remember I was, I think, the only analyst at my last gig, and I did an analysis which basically said we should launch this product feature, and I was pretty excited about it. I was also going really fast. I was on a roll. And then, I don't know why, I think I put the analysis out there. Our CEO saw it, was like, you know what, we're going to go ahead with this. On a Friday night, for some reason, I had this weird feeling I need to go back and check my analysis. I went back and I found out I had made a pretty big mistake. In actuality, the results weren't positive. They were, I think, negative or neutral. But long story short, this product feature should not have been launched. And so luckily I caught it at the right time, so we didn't actually push it out. But what was really hard to deal with was I felt like my credibility was affected because I had to go out there and tell a range of senior leaders I made a mistake. And for just going back to what Bekah said, there's this feeling of needing to be perfect. And I think that was playing in my mind. And that one experience really lowered my self-esteem and confidence. And how I overcame it, I remember talking to my manager and telling her, listen, I messed up, I'm so sorry. And I think the response was really helpful because I realized I made this a bigger deal in my head than anyone ever really thought it was. Like, no one thought this was a big deal. They were happy it was caught, even if it got launched. Something I heard was, this is a reversible change, it's fine. Also, we're not saving lives. I mean, unless you're in the medical profession, you are. So keep that in mind. Of course, if you're going to health tech, you might need to be a little careful. But for me, we were selling boxes. And it was okay to make that mistake. And so keep in mind, one, making mistakes is very normal. That's how you learn. Two, sleep is so underrated. Please get enough sleep. Please look, when you do any sort of analysis, it's okay to sleep over it, look at it again. You're going to find things when you're overwhelmed, you miss things. And I think I was probably overwhelmed. I had a lot going on. Probably took a lot for granted because I was on this, high road and this trajectory. So definitely don't take that don't take the sleep for granted. Definitely sleep enough. So understand mistakes are normal and definitely sleep over any problem.
Yeah, I just want to add, I totally agree, that people fail all the time. Like, we are in Silicon Valley, people are starting companies and figuring things out as they go, right? Like, it's very normal to be trying new things, and only by failing, you will fail from time to time, right? If you're the kind of person who wants to try new things, you will fail time to time. And the main thing is, are you good at figuring out the insight about what happened, right? Like, if there was an analysis that went wrong, you have a deep insight for how to not let that happen again. That is very powerful, right? So if you focus on that, what is it that you can learn that can lead to a leap for you? The other thing that I do is I think about, I have a 5-year-old. If she fails, how am I going to approach that? I'll tell her, I really appreciate your attitude, your spirit, the way you tried, right? I'll tell her it's not a big deal. You're just 5. You're going to be doing so many things. It's cool, right? So think of like a loved one. Like, how do you approach that? And think of being kind to yourself. And just like your manager was kind to you, right? She saw that. So, those are the two things. And yeah, you're going to be failing from time to time. It's not a big deal.
Last thing I'll touch on, I know we're running short on time. I really liked Megan's point around being afraid to self-promote. And so I was going to talk about a different experience of failure, since we all have many. But one thing that I'm realizing I fell into the trap of when I started as a consultant, and I was the only female in my office in my starting class, was this trap of like the catty woman and the fact that women can't support each other. And I know there's this story of these 4 Merrill Lynch women who were top executives who actually would come together for lunch once a month, and they would share about their accomplishments, and then they would go into their different departments and their groups, and they would celebrate those accomplishments. And even though women tend to be receive negative feedback when they promote themselves, I think there's a lot of value that can be taken from finding a group that's going to advocate for each other, sharing those, and not being afraid to, and don't have the tiara syndrome where you just think, oh, if I do a good job, somebody will reward me. You actually need to be talking about those experiences and find a group that you can be intentional with it, and then start advocating for them as well, because that actually looks really good for you when you're promoting others and advocating for them.
I think this touches on an important point about building community. In my role at Parity, I actually have the opportunity to work with women who are building community together, and it's absolutely invaluable. And there's also a lot of research that shows that women start networking and building their networks later, and they're less likely to reach out for help. And so I think mentorship, I talked to all of you kind of in advance of this panel, was a topic that came up for everybody. So I would love to hear, there are different kinds of mentorship, whether that's peer-to-peer mentorship or your direct boss, or even recruiters who have kind of come into play and given you critical career advice. How would you recommend somebody new to the industry kind of starts to find that community, find mentorship? What steps can they take to kind of set themselves up there?
Guess I can go for it. Okay. So first, when looking for a mentor, I think we all know, don't ask, like, will you be my mentor? Find somebody who is doing the things that you want to do, that you're passionate about, and then excel at something. So say, hey, I want to volunteer for this initiative that you're working on, and really contribute things that are going to add value for them. And then don't take that relationship for granted. I think it's easy to develop a more personal relationship, and then you're like, oh, we're just meeting up monthly to get to know each other. Their time's really valuable, and so you need to show actively that you are taking the advice that they're giving you and you're applying it, and then come back with other really thoughtful questions that you couldn't just find when you're Googling. I've been asked questions before on phone calls where you're like, oh, I think you could have seen that. So I think that's just something smart to think about when you're investing in a mentor relationship. The second part around peer-to-peer mentorship, I love one of the stories that Sheryl actually tells earlier on in her career when she was considering taking a role at a small startup called Google. All of her mentors actually told her not to take the job. It was her peer group that she had that really advocated for that and said, no, you should take that risk. This is a really amazing opportunity, and don't be afraid to take it. And so I think there is incredible power in that peer-to-peer mentorship, meeting frequently and being vulnerable, like we talked about with things like imposter syndrome. learn how to negotiate together, practice those conversations with each other, especially if they're in your workplace, then they understand the different dynamics that you're facing. They're going to be able to give really practical advice, and you won't be as afraid of failing if you fail in front of them instead of on your big presentation. So I think really take advantage of peer-to-peer mentorship.
The thing I'd add to that is definitely like spend time thinking about what you want to make those like 30 minutes about. Oftentimes I think I've noticed people early in their career will schedule a meeting with someone senior and not really have anything substantial to discuss. And I think keep in mind that that time is valuable. The other thing I want to touch on is also like our inner mentor. It's very important to have mentors that keep checking you, but keep in mind that you also have this inner mentor that has a lot of intuition, a lot of advice, a lot of wisdom. I think women tend to have that, and I just wish if we channeled it a bit more, I feel like we'd make the society a bit better. We'd make smarter decisions. So keep in mind that you have this internal voice as well that you can channel. And in terms of like finding the right person, I think definitely keep it authentic. You don't just asking for, I've often found the best mentorships have formed very naturally, where I've worked with the person, we have like a similar interest. Maybe we had a starting class together and we chatted about something, and I found their perspective very interesting, and then we kind of had a conversation about it. So keeping it natural, keeping it organic, and it doesn't need to seem forced, because the worst thing you could do is if both of you feel like the time is not well spent. So keep that in mind when looking for a mentor.
One thing that I would add is, like we've been talking about failure, right? Just give it a shot. It's okay. Nobody minds it, you know? Like if there's somebody really interesting, you want to talk to them, just give it a shot. Big deal.
The last piece I would say, so I got very lucky with my manager, one of them at Facebook, who is now just like so invaluable to me. But even with that very key person, I've also thought about mentorship more as like a complementary set of humans, that each one is kind of like, I know this person is very good at X. I respect the way that they approach things or think about things. I may not go to them for anything else, right? It's just, and I'm respectful. Like I loved what you said, Bekah, about making sure you honor their time. Like you don't want to waste their time. And I think if you can think about this complementary set of people, you can do that sometimes even better, because I'm not trying to go to you for every single thing. This is what this relationship feeds on, and then this is what this other relationship feeds on. And so you can kind of create a super mentor through all these different facets that you have among your relationships. So again, great if you find an amazing one. I'm very grateful for somebody that I would really give that hat to. But I also have a lot of really impressive and energizing, all those good words. I have a lot of people in my life that do that for me that probably I wouldn't give the sole hat to, but have become very valuable.
All right, well, thank you to all of you. I think it's really valuable to recognize that there are many forms of mentorship and that not one person has to be your mentor. You can have kind of a community of people who kind of support and uplift you in many different facets of your life. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to actually open up the questions to the audience to see if anybody has anything that they want to ask our panelists.
Yes, hi. I had a question about, I'll give some brief context. I mentor some junior colleagues at my company, and I had the awesome opportunity to mentor this young woman, and she really took off, and after 2 years, she got this amazing job, and she moved up in our company and everything. And then we hired a young man to replace her, and I've been mentoring him, and it's become very clear to me that mentoring men and women is different. And I found mentoring this young man very difficult. whereas the young woman really worked hard. She could admit when she made mistakes. She always wanted to improve herself. This young man kind of takes all of that for granted. So I just wanted to see if you had any advice for this kind of situation. Maybe it's just this unique situation. It might not just be gender. It might just be him. But yeah, I'm just looking for some guidance there, if you have any.
So one thing I would say is that mentoring is not part of your role, I'm assuming, right? You're going out of your way to mentor these people. I've been in a similar situation when I'm managing a group of people, and my approach to managing tends to be coming from, there's a strong element of mentorship because I really enjoy that. And there have been situations where I feel that they take it for granted, right? And there's something I'm still working on, but the one thing that I think about is that there is something about getting the job done. And when you, how do you effectively project manage so that the task gets done? And the responsibility is on them to, if they need help, to come and ask for help, right? So the thing I tell myself is I'm their manager, I'm not their mom. You know, that's what I tell myself, you know, like, so that's one thing, that if I feel like they're not going to appreciate it, then it's better for me to spend that time somewhere else. It's better for the company.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm wondering if you could speak to ageism, which tends to affect women and men disproportionately, especially since I'm just reading that the Bay Area tends to hire younger, like by 10 years, than anywhere else in the country. Thanks.
So, so I can relate to that a little bit. You know, oftentimes I'm at lunch at work and I'm the only parent around, and I'm talking about my kid, what I did over the weekend, and people are talking about Game of Thrones. I have no idea, right? Like I have no idea what they're talking about, right? So there is that, you know, I can see that. And then people say that, you know, oh, it's so nice that now we have people around who have kids. Right? But that's actually the normal world, right? Like it's so there is that. The thing I again do is that there are a lot of companies that are trying to work around these issues to really build healthy teams, healthy cultures. So you have to choose them, just like we talked about the gender issue. I think ageism is something we don't talk about as much, but it's the same strategy. So part of the career strategy is I have to increase my options so that I can pick healthy culture. So what do I have to do to build a skill set so that I have multiple options? And then I go to then I get to pick. So that's the way I've approached it. I think there is the other aspect of now as a manager, how can you go create a culture that's healthy? That's a separate aspect. But when you're choosing for yourself, you just have to not go to places that have that issue.
Thank you so much, Sameera. We have time for one last question, if anybody. There we go. Okay.
I was waiting for this question. So the thing to remember is that culture is dynamic. You know, so when people join the company, people leave the company, culture changes, right? So there can be, I have seen companies that I thought had an amazing culture, but when I go interview, my experience is different. And similarly at Uber, for me, it was the opposite. I was pleasantly surprised by what I was finding out about how there is a very strong effort to change the culture. And that's not surprising, right? Like they have to do that. So the culture is changing. I grilled everybody I knew who had any data about this. I grilled the team, and I only joined because I felt that this is a good place to be. So the thing I would again say is that culture is dynamic. It changes with time. It can also change with team. You know, you might think that, hey, from the press and everything looks like this is an amazing company. It might turn out that the team you're joining has a toxic culture. It has also happened that sometimes when I talk to other people at Uber who've been longer, and I ask them, how did you survive? And they say, well, our team was doing great. You know, this whole 50 people I work with, this is all like amazing. So it can change, sometimes something to watch out for.
I think that's a really important point, that teams can have their own culture inside of a larger culture. And also the point that you should spend time talking to people who work at that company as a way to get more data on what the internal company culture looks like beyond just the interview. So with that, I think that's about time that we have for today. Hopefully our panelists will stick around afterwards to answer some additional questions. And thank you everyone for coming.